document for you too. I'm Amanda Wynne-Jones. I'm work for Howden Insurance Brokers, and we're just going to run through a few things tonight with you. A little bit about Howden, a very short introduction to the service team. What is insurance? Because very often people think about insurance and they think it covers everything. So just a general overview. Importance of risk management, member liability insurances, and then touching on what if something goes wrong. So when you need help, if there's a claim or an incident that needs support. So Howden are an insurance broker. We're part of the largest independent insurance broker in the world. It's Howden Sport and Entertainment Team, where the British Orienteering insurances are managed. And we have looked after insurances in various guises for sport over the last 35, 40, probably 40 plus years actually, but in the current way that we operate, about 35 years, our team have worked with a wide range of sports and recreation clients. That's everything from international, regional and national governing bodies, all the way down to the individual athletes that participate or the recreational volunteers that support them. We're an official partner for Sport and Recreation Alliance, and we have been since 1985. So it's been quite a long relationship we've had with them. I'm Amanda Wynne-Jones, already introduced myself. I've worked in the insurance industry for probably about 35 years now. I'm losing count, and for my sins. And 20 years of that have been within the sport and the entertainment sector. So I work with predominantly the national governing body support and general sport and recreation activity. I'm supported by David Gilding, who's a senior broker. He's been with Howden Sport and Entertainment Team for 8 years, but he also has in excess of 30 years insurance industry knowledge. And Sophia Hussain has about 15 to 20 years been working in the insurance industry, and within that she's done a number of years, with about 8 years with the Sport and Entertainment Team too. So what is insurance? Very simply, it's a method of transferring a risk that you have to protect from financial loss. That can be property damage, it could be business interruption, there may be reputational issues, injury sustained to yourself or to a third party, anything that may have a financial repercussion and a loss involved. And although it's really inconvenient that we damage or have lost our equipment and we're financially inconvenienced by a result of that, the big part of today's webinar is going to be around the liability insurance that we have in place with for British Orienteering. The key thing there is that we must remember that we all have a duty of care to those around us, that we don't negligently damage their property or injure them. So providing insurance, the key thing insurers expect from us is a contract that is in place between British Orienteering and the insurance company. And as a result, they expect us to act reasonably. So as a club, as the governing body, and as the individual member, there's a duty to act reasonably in managing the risk to mitigate any potential losses. So where does that lead, that mitigation of risk? So the key there is understanding what's a hazard and what is actually the risk. So when the chance of that causing harm to somewhere or causing damage to somebody. Insurers expect that reasonableness. You'll see a repetitive nature of that reasonableness throughout. And that's really to help you to understand the expectations on what maybe voluntary organisations through to companies may be looked at carefully to manage those risks. The big question insurers often ask us if we're going to them with a new idea or a change of hazard activity is, would the insured person or governing body or sport still do this if they didn't have an insurer supporting them with a financial cost to pay the defences and the awards that might come from that? And that's often a good question to ask yourself. Do you think this is really safe enough if you were footing the bill yourself? Would you still do it the same way and manage it carefully? The other way of managing those risks is often people get a bit scared about the risk management and the hazard management in there. And we often quote this statement that Health and Safety Executive gave to us when we were working on a few risk management projects with them. And it's the key message of don't overcomplicate the process. Risks are already, you're pretty much managing a risk and risk assessing as you walk into a room. And you look at the floor, if you're not going to trip over that great big hole or that bag that's been left in the middle of the floor. You do it automatically in your own mind. And it's basically having those control measures recorded is a key way. The next slide really has been developed specifically for our sports and entertainment team and recreational activities. Every little thing that you can see on that little picture has triggered an incident or a claim at some time in our 35 years that we're looking after the sport, whether that be something to do with the music being too loud and interfering, the weather conditions were not considered when an event was taking place, holes, water spilt everywhere. You have the safeguarding matter of who's being permitted into the venue. There's such a wide range of risks that you need to think about in those hazards and how you manage them. And to help you, British Orienteering have developed their own risk assessment guidance. And this next slide is just some examples that are used within their own template to give you a good idea of where to start, really. And that does literally from the looking at the indoor, outdoor, whether that's a social event, whether it's a fundraising, whether it's the presentation evening, all the way through to running an actual competition itself. Each one of those risks has a consequence potentially. Not always is someone to blame, but very often someone will be looking to see whether someone did something wrong. And that's where the insurance steps in to support you. Slips and trips seem quite normal in the outdoor world. When you're on uneven territory, these are going to happen. It results in the twisted ankles, the broken limbs, the facial injuries, etc., and even the psychological damage that results from those too. And the question will often come: was there something else you could have done? Was there something to blame? Did you do what was reasonable to keep them safe? Another area that we see examples of the lack of the prompt medical attention. So not having the right first aiders available straight away, not calling the ambulance immediately, or not being careful when managing the injury that can exacerbate or the existing condition or lead to greater injury as well. Errors and omissions, this could be from the management of the club itself through to following the right procedures or processes or rules that you have in place through your robust constitution is quite important in those circumstances, all the way through to teaching and coaching and having the right qualification to deliver the session that's in place. Any of those things, if there's a lack, can result in injury, could be gradually developing if there's a particular technique that's not being done correctly. And then there's the management liability exposure. Other areas we see liability risks occurring are libel and slander, defamation, being careful what you say about the people within your club, the people that you operate with in your region. Be careful about prospective members and how you talk about them and where you share that information as well. That damage to reputation, that breach of libel and slander often comes from disciplinary matters that clubs hold, and the individual member perhaps being suspended, etc. The reputational harm that can do to them and potentially financially too. And then another area that you often don't think about when you think specifically liability insurance are things like breach of intellectual property. Lots of clubs will have websites, lots of clubs will produce documentation, they will get that information sometimes from other sources, and it's really important that you look at the copyright rules, where you're getting that information, and if you're posting it on your own site, check that you're legally able to do so. We've seen claims, they're very difficult to defend because if it's sitting on your website or within your technical brochure that's been taken from somebody else, it's quite obvious that it's there, and sometimes it is unfortunate that claims just have to be paid. So what we do for British Orienteering clubs and the members is a liability insurance. So as we touched on earlier, Howden is the insurance broker. Hiscox is the current liability insurer, and British Orienteering themselves is the policyholder. By virtue of your affiliation to British Orienteering, you are entitled to access the policy, entitled to an indemnity and a defence under that policy. The insurances are reviewed every 12 months on the 1st of January, and you will regularly see in your club portal and your web on the British Orienteering website updated documents or information that we share at that time. If there are changes, that may happen at that time, and so what we're talking about really is the current insurance programme. So who, where and what is the insurance going to apply to? On the next slide, I'll be talking specifically about the who that we've recognised overall. But if you're volunteering or if you're employed by a British Orienteering Club, if you're employed by British Orienteering, if you volunteer in those roles, there's a liability insurance there to protect you for your role in that club. And the key here is to what is the British Orienteering recognised activities, which we will touch on separately. Member clubs are provided with an evidence of insurance each year, so something you can show to a landlord or a landowner so that you can have access to their site if necessary. And it may be you're running events or working with schools, etc. Again, you've got that evidence of insurance. A brief summary is also included, along with some FAQs, and they're on the microsite with British Orienteering, their own website to provide the detail for you. Some of those FAQs will be updated following the session today. We've had some, thank you very much for everybody that submitted questions before tonight. We will include those on the general FAQs and any additional ones we can add as we go through to the evening. All insurances, whatever they are and whoever you buy them from, will have terms, conditions, exclusions and obligations. These are detailed on the full policy wording, which is submitted to the policyholder, being British Orienteering, every year. Now, we provide summaries and overviews of that, and we can provide some guidance if necessary, but every policy that you purchase from an insurance perspective will have certain expectations on you. And the one we particularly remind, again, is the reasonable precautions. They expect you to act reasonably to prevent a claim or an accident occurring under the policy. So the who. We've got quite a long list, as you will see there, from British Orienteering at the top, and we build all the constituent parts into the current insurance arrangements, all the way down to the volunteers, the coaches, the map runners, the controllers, event planners, etc., etc. There's a big long list there. Most roles might fall into a volunteer, but it's important that you understand that the full spectrum really of who we're picking up. So likewise, in a club, it'll be the club committee, it'll be the volunteers in that club and the club members. The next important thing to consider is the when. So at what point is the insurance applicable to you and your club and to the organisation? And the key here is the recognised activities. British Orienteering advise to us a various lists of things that they expect their members to do, that they do as a governing body, and the areas that they want to recognise within the current insurance programme for the insurers to accept as part of the duty presentation of the overall risk. This cover applies in the UK, so it's UK clubs operating their club within the UK environment, but it does extend to temporary visits outside of the UK. So you maybe the club might attend a competition, you might want to do a club tour, club specific events and training, etc. outside of the UK. That can be included. You just need to register those events and that training with British Orienteering. Members are only insured to participate in the foot and the trail orienteering. So members are not insured, for example, for the ski or the mountain bike. Clubs and club planners are, however, insured for the planning of those, so but not the individual members. Where there's a training qualification required, so if it's coaching, formal coaching sessions, and you need the appropriate coach, the insurance applies to the member's level of qualification. So you shouldn't be acting beyond that you have your qualification for or your training for. And the other key area is when we say about British Orienteering recognised activity, that addresses adhering to your codes of conduct, the British Orienteering rules of shooting, the rules implied, the guidance documents that they issue, safeguarding included in that. Your clubs will have your own constitutions as well, and it's important that you understand and follow the rules of your constitution and the process that's in there too. There's one extension onto where you may earn, and that's coaches and mappers. Those that are recorded with us can have a turnover up to 10,000 within the existing insurance programme. If you go above and beyond that, it's considered more of a business by the insurer, and they would want you to purchase separate insurance for that element. Now, a big area of the FAQs and questions that came in was regarding where non-members are also insured. So we're touching on the next few slides on the areas that we protect for those. A couple of years ago, many years, we've always recognised the 3 initial taster club sessions, but in recent years, we also extended the non-member being insured at a competition. So the key here is, who is it we're insuring? It's those non-members whilst they're undertaking what is British Orienteering non-member recognised activity. So activity being the 3 club taster sessions. So it's attending your club with the intention and the aim to become a member of your club. Those first 3 sessions, we will insure them and the club in that environment. If that person wants to continue to get insurance, let's face it, we're a membership organisation. We want them to become members of that organisation, be it the club and British Orienteering. So from their 4th session, they should become a member for the insurance to continue while they're participating in that club activity. The second non-member recognised is the competition. So participants that registered at a British Orienteering recognised competition. They must be declared to British Orienteering, and you must record their name, address, and share that with British Orienteering so that we can always trace them as the non-member in attendance. British Orienteering has specifically got a couple of definitions to help that distinction between the 3 taster session, of what is an activity, and then the competition, which is defined here for you. So as I touched on earlier, the activity, that coming and getting involved, becoming a club member and contributing to the club, it's that intention, the gathering, the practice, the training, etc. And then the competition being under competition rules with the winners and places in place. Now we've said the who and the where, and this is the insurance that's in place. Most liability policies that clubs or individuals or even some governing bodies buy might just be public liability insurance. What Howden do is we offer a package. It builds in and crosses certain gaps between the various exposures that we've seen in our experience over the years. So you'll get public liability insurance, which is primarily legal liability, defence for injury or damage to third-party property. So this is a third-party exposure. They've been injured at, for example, at one of your events, and they may blame you or suggest that there is an allegation of blame. This policy would be there effectively to defend those circumstances. The abuse has an extension to that policy, but this is ensuring the club committee for their role in managing safeguarding within the organisation. We don't insure the individual alleged abuser. It is more the environment that the clubs are operating to ensure that they've done the right DBS checks on the regulated activity, ensured the safety of those people at risk, so adults at risk or children in that environment. The second element of the insurance is the professional indemnity insurance, and this is negligent acts, errors or omissions, often where the libel and slander or the defamation may fall as well. Could be arising from the advice of the club or the coach or the environment that you operate. Club committees have the individual directors and officers extension. So this is claims that might arise for allegations of wrongful acts against individual named directors or officers, committee members, trustees of the club. If it's a legal entity, so it might be a registered charity. Some clubs might register as a charity, might have a limited company, limited by guarantee, etc. we also extend to include the corporate legal entity extension. Now, where there's a personal injury claim all the way through, it will usually be directed back to the public liability insurance. But if there are individual allegations for wrongful acts against those individual directors, the committee members, then that's where we would direct the directors and officers insurance. And then finally, the club also benefit from employers' liability insurance. Now, the majority of clubs won't have paid employees in their environment, but the definition that we have within our policy recognises volunteers may be classed as an employee, dependent on the circumstances. And to ensure that you've got that protection, if a third-party solicitor brings a claim, we always make sure that that volunteer role and the employer's liability is incorporated in the arrangement. So this would be a volunteer or an employee, if they are paid, injuring themselves during the course of their employment or their volunteering time with you as the club. And this would protect you for the defence of that allegation. So once we know we've got the insurance, what happens next? What happens when something goes wrong? Now, usually claimants are looking for a financial compensation. That's normally what helps us to identify that this is going to become a claim. Every year we share the incident notification guidelines, which are on your website and that British Orienteering share with the member clubs. It's really important that any incident that could give rise to a claim is notified immediately, as soon as you're aware of them. It's getting the information to us quickly when it's fresh in everybody's mind, everybody can remember the circumstance. If something came in, a claim came in 2 or 3 years down the line, which is we see happen sometimes, under the Limitations Act, people do have time to bring their personal injury claim, then it is important that we have the information at the time when it was fresh in their mind of what happened and the general information. To help guide you, we've got a list of sort of circumstances we say absolutely immediately tell us. Fatal accidents, injury involving either referral to a hospital or needing treatment, head injuries, fractures, broken limbs, loss of sight, anything to do with unconsciousness and those types of things. Absolutely, please just tell us. It might not ever become a claim, but it's important that we are notified so that we can record it with the insurer and they can ask the questions at that time of the club and what happened. The other thing we specifically ask that needs prompt attention are things like libel and slander, defamation, anything that's an investigation under child protection legislation, or something which might be triggering your safeguarding policies. Again, it's really important that we get that information early, as soon as you're aware of it. And the key thing here is we don't need even names, as long as you've got a code and it can be identified. We don't need to share, because I know people are really sensitive about how much information they share on a safeguarding matter. But if you want the insurers to be able to respond or need to click in if there is a civil liability claim arising from any of these matters, then they need to have the information available to them so that they can do early investigations where necessary. This list isn't exhaustive. There's lots of other situations that may arise within a club environment or at an event that you're not sure. They can simply be notified and they are just held as that, a notification, waiting in case a claim does arise later, a civil liability claim. Now, when you notify our claims team, there's certain things that we specifically ask that you do and don't do. The first is don't admit anything, don't discuss it, and certainly don't make an offer to pay, because sometimes nobody is to blame and actually no settlement is necessary. And it's very important that because you don't make any promises, because the insurers may not support you in that at all. They have the right to walk away. In the case of notification, there's particular things we will ask you to do. We'll ask you to fill in a notification form, and that's where the full details are initially recorded. We will always ask for copies of the current risk assessment relating to the activity, both pre and post incident. So if there's a risk assessment done immediately after, to check the circumstances and reinforce the message. Accident book entry. Now, we do ask that you retain as a club your own accident book. Don't rely on a venue's accident book. You must hold your own and record the information there too. If there's any witnesses or witness details, get them recorded, get a list of their names, contact information. Again, the insurers will probably ask for that information to help with any preparation for defence. And if there are photographs available of the area, please take some. And sometimes there'll be CCTV footage. If it's available, then we will often ask you to investigate access to that. What's extremely important is if you've had a letter, if you've had a claim, a writ or a summons, please forward it to Howden's claim team, either via British Orienteering or direct, immediately on receipt and unanswered. Please do not try to respond immediately. It's up to the insurers. Will have strict time frames that they have to respond. They understand that, and they will go through the process and get the relevant information before they do the response. What's key from your perspective is that there are strict time frames. So as soon as you're aware of something, please let us know so that our claims team can start to manage it as quickly as possible. Now, I've touched on some areas of incident notifications that we need to be aware of, and you'll probably recognise some of those are also very similar to those that are RIDDOR reported, reportable injuries that the government expect. Now, they are not specifically RIDDOR incidents on the incident notification. It's just that we know that those types of head injuries, serious injuries, etc., or hospitalisation often trigger a civil liability claim, which is why it's important that we let the insurers know about them straight away. There may, and I only say may, also be obligations for you to report some of those incidents as they occur under the RIDDOR regulations. And for example, that might be a volunteer. We've touched already on the potential of a volunteer environment being a work environment, and some accidents that are to members of the public generally. So there is 2 links there that I've shared. I am not a RIDDOR advisor, but there are some general overview government advice about what should be reported. So certain serious incidents may need to be reported to RIDDOR too. What happens next? You've reported the information. We've got the general overview, and the next stage is the decision of the insurers, whether that's the third-party solicitors will get in touch and tell us what they want, and then the insurers will decide how and if they can respond to that. I would say liability claims take a long time. If it's not clear-cut in those early stages and there's potentially a defence and it goes to court, it can take years to finalise a liability claim. If it's quite clear, sometimes it can be managed outside of the courts, whether that is a denial of liability, the insurers may submit because you've been able to evidence lots of supporting information to defend the matter, whether that's your risk assessments, proving your reasonableness in managing the exposure, etc. And others may be that we just have to, I touched on it earlier with the breach of copyright, for example. Sometimes the hand has to go up and we just have to manage the costs that will be involved, and the solicitors and the insurers will be part of that. There was perhaps a negligence attaching, and it's just managing what the final award is going to look like and any legal costs involved. So those will tend to be managed outside of the court where possible. The key there again is supplying the essential support for your defence, which is the risk management documentation, your rules, your constitution. If it's regarding disciplinary matters and allegations, then your constitutional process and your rules within the club, and that you have followed them. Record these, please, and retain those risk assessments, because we never quite know when you may get called upon to evidence them if a claim does come a few years down the line. The one message that is repeated to me in every legal training I go to with the solicitors we work with on the liability claims is if it's not written down, it doesn't exist and they cannot use it to defend you. And I have a good example of this outside of the world of orienteering, but in the world of tennis, where we had 2 clubs who were both responsible for maintenance of the courts. On each of the courts, they had a maintenance programme. One had it all written down to clear the moss, to prevent the slips. the other did not. They were still doing it, but they did not have that evidence. The first club produced this documentation following a slip that caused a leg and a broken arm injury and broken leg. The third-party solicitor took one look at all the evidence that was produced as to why we thought it was reasonable and why we were denying liability, and they stepped away. They didn't pursue the claim. They didn't carry on. The second club was not able to produce that evidence, and a £14,000 settlement had to be made through that process because we didn't have any documentation the solicitor could work with to defend the injury occurring. So even though they were doing it, they just didn't have it recorded. And that could be the difference between availability of insurance in years to come and not if we have a string of claims of that type. So where you can find more information, if you need some advice on your membership itself, the rules, the policies, procedures, or the recognised activity, we recommend that you go through British Orienteering Federation, and membership team are there to support you. At the moment, insurance queries also go via British Orienteering. I'm more than happy to discuss various inquiries with you, but we will also need to discuss them with British Orienteering too. Likewise, if an incident has occurred, you can direct that to British Orienteering first, or it can come to Howden direct as well. We produce the frequently asked questions every year which are shared with you, and these will be available again to the specific insurance questions after the session today. Now that leads me into the questions that were raised pre this session tonight. So we have a few which I've tried to group together into, because there were a lot of questions from different clubs that actually had a very similar question behind them. The three taster session, hopefully I've touched on that earlier. It's regarding the club activity, so that with the aim of them becoming a club member. Non-members at competitions, they're only going to be insured if they are registered if the competition is registered with British Orienteering and that non-member is registered with British Orienteering too. There's been a couple of questions around the setting of map run courses and permanent orienteering courses. And if these are not supervised, then the club or the map run individual will be covered for the preparation, I suppose, or the planning of that course. But those participating, if it's unsupervised, won't be covered whilst they're taking part. If there is a staged, supervised, supported event, however, and it's registered, then it can be, those participating can be covered too. Equipment, there was a few people asking about the signage, various clubs' equipment that they own themselves. The insurance is provided to British Orienteering is a liability insurance policy. There is no cover for equipment owned or in the property or control of the club. So if you have your own equipment or you have anything, whether that's buildings or as little as your walkie-talkies on the day, if there's something that you need insuring, you need to get separate property insurance for that. Back to non-members again, we understand that some clubs will run non-membership programs, so they might be for longer than the 3 taster sessions. It's important to understand that we're only insuring the club in those environments. So whilst those programs might involve more than the 3 taster sessions, we're not insuring the individuals participating in those if they're not a member of the organisation. But we are insuring the club for managing that programme and delivering it, but we would ask that it be recorded with British Orienteering. Travel was another thing. Some clubs will have the overseas. I've touched on that a little bit earlier. They might travel abroad. The third-party liability insurance will recognise that. So the public liability will extend to that trip. It's really important, however, that you understand you've got broad duties of care to your members participating and those accompanying them. Remember your safeguarding responsibilities and all the additional responsibilities that bring. The thing I do need to stress, though, is there is no what we would describe as travel insurance. Insurance by British Orienteering is just the liability. So if you've got health, medical need, medical insurance, loss of passport, baggage, flights, delays, cancellations, That's a travel insurance policy, and you'd need to arrange those separately. Another question that was raised was specifically around urban events. And I think the description of that was that people are very good at looking at that map, not necessarily the environment that they're operating in. Like any event, urban or in the open countryside, it is important that the risk management reflects the individual activity that you're leading, and that the discipline needs to reflect the hazards and the exposures that you're managing. The next one is, again, another non-member participation. The question was, what if they cause injury or damage whilst they're at the competitions or at your events? Now, if the claim comes against the non-member, if it's not a 3-session taster session and it's not a registered competition, then that non-member is not going to benefit from the liability insurance here, and they will need to defend that themselves. If it fits into that 3-taster session or the registered competition, then the British Orienteering registration, the insurance can supply it. The other thing to remember, though, is if you're delivering the event and the claim comes against you as the club, for example, such as the inappropriate supervision, or you weren't managing the event correctly, and there are allegations about that mismanagement, then the liability insurance under the British Orienteering will protect you, and will be there to be considered. The claim can be submitted for consideration. And then finally, from the pre-session questions, there was specific questions around what do the committee members get insured for. Now, I touched on the different sections of cover earlier. Now, if it's a personal injury claim, that would still be directed against the public liability section of the policy, because that's recognising members, committee members, etc. If a claim comes regarding the mismanagement of the organisation of the club, and there's allegations against individual directors and officers, we would direct it to the individual directors and officers. Obviously, your personal assets are at risk, your home, etc. And this is to help protect those so that any claim is managed under the liability insurance and can be considered to protect that personal liability. Where there's a limited company or a registered charity, and there is a corporate legal entity, and a mismanagement claim was to come against that, then when the corporate legal liability section would also protect the club. So what else would you need? So we've touched on what the British Orienteering Insurance is liability, and all of these are additional insurances that you might need to consider to protect your club and your members. The overseas travel, I touched on it just not a moment ago. Assets and buildings as well. If you've got an asset that you want to protect, then there's policies that are available for portable equipment as well as fixed assets too. You might want to think about insurance which is no fault. So the club's members injuring themselves, no one to blame, just potentially a personal accident insurance. Those types of things are available for our sport and recreation bodies. And then the other exposures that we see regularly for clubs are cyber exposures, and I think everybody will have seen the increased phishing and attempt to get personal information these days. The lockdown and COVID exposures just increased that activity tenfold over the last 2 or 3 years. And then the other thing which can be helpful for clubs and members to investigate is things like legal expenses and helplines for managing the club day-to-day legal matters. So hopefully that overview has given a good understanding really of the general insurances that we have in place and what we expect of you in the event of an incident going forward. As mentioned at the beginning, this is information as at today's date for this year, the 2023 insurance period, and it's just a summary. So I hope that has helped. Now, if anybody's got any specific questions that we haven't addressed during that discussion, please let me know. Now, as I was on the screen view, I didn't have access to all the questions at that time, so I do apologise I couldn't answer as we were going through.
I think it's fair to say, Amanda, Peter and Peter have done a pretty good job answering most of those questions. So if you have any questions, any insurance questions for Amanda, if you'd like to raise your hand, then we can manage the questions that way, and that'd be really helpful. Thank you. So William from Interlopers, there's a question. William, we can't hear you at the moment.
Still can't hear you. I don't know if you can hear us.
He's on mute at the minute. It worked earlier when you had your headset on, so I don't know if you can unmute with the headset on.
Shall we move to Ben?
Yeah.
Who's got his hand up? Ben, have you got your question, please?
Yeah, my question is about urban orienteering, which feels like it's high risk because of the potential of a serious accident to a third party. But I wonder whether we have any experience of incidents and claims arising from urban orienteering, and any picture of what is required to demonstrate that your activity was reasonably safe, or that you took reasonable steps to ensure that it was safe.
Apologies, my mic went funny then. As regards to orienteering, it's basically, I think I touched on it a little bit anyway. It's just that there is an exposure. It's just a different exposure. And the key from our perspective is that you are managing that and you're recognizing that it is a different exposure when urban orienteering is taking place. And therefore making the participants aware, not just the club who are managing it, but obviously making participants aware of what they should be doing when they're participating in the different environments. Now, we have had notifications of incidents that happen all the way across all the different disciplines of orienteering, but it hasn't specifically triggered any increased number that I'm aware of.
Can I maybe
from my perspective, I'm quite pleased about that because you know, it means that somebody is managing it correctly at that on the ground, basically.
Yeah. An example that springs to my mind is the World Championships, which are taking place in Edinburgh next year, and how you could reasonably expect athletes competing for a world title to remember to stop and not cross the road or not knock over the little old lady on Edinburgh's Royal Mile. And that balance between, I suppose, really elite, intense competition and that environment where there are going to be lots of members of the public, lots of spectators as well.
The key to that then is going to be the risk management. It's the risk assessment for the particular event that's being delivered. And absolutely, given that environment, there will be a higher expectation because of the nature that is being managed appropriately. So the course will need to reflect the exposure, really, with the risk management.
Amanda, William's put his question into the chat. I don't know if you can see that now. So the question is around committee liability. And if you want to answer that one, please.
Right. So the question is, sorry, I was just running down it. My question was about the committee liability. Obviously, the officers cover provides up to, I think, 5 million. Yeah, it does for the directors and officers personally, but isn't unlimited. Does becoming a charity or Scottish charity mean individual committee members can't be sued? No, it doesn't mean you cannot limit your liability for injury or property damage, particularly for injury in the UK law. So it doesn't stop just because you don't have an insurance for something, for example, doesn't mean it's going to stop them suing you. But as regards to you as the individual director, we've got limits up to the 5 million to protect you in that environment. I think a lot of people get confused, and I will touch on this with their constitution say our liability is limited to £1 within their constitution. They get quite confused. That's the financial security of the actual constitution, the club itself, perhaps. it does not limit your legal liability for injury at all. And even under corporate entities, it doesn't protect you personally as a director. It doesn't prevent that exposure. I hope that's answered the question.
Thank you, Amanda. And Jane, you have a question for us.
Yes, I'd like to get the answer to this question once and for all. How long do we need to keep our records for of people who attend our events?
If you ask an insurance company, they'll say forever. I'm being really honest with you, because a claim could happen. Although there is elements of guidance under the Limitation Act for personal injury claims, as we all know, safeguarding matters can fall outside of that and can happen many, many, many years after an incident actually occurred. The guidance that we give is a minimum of, whereas a claim or an incident involved, we say a minimum of 6 years and longer where children are involved or minors are involved. And I am not a solicitor, so I cannot, as you say, categorically answer that question. We can only give you guidance. And the guidance that we're given is that it should, you should hold on to it for quite a significant time. You don't have to hold on to lots and lots of personal information, but we certainly need to be able to identify someone was perhaps a member or someone was attending an event at a particular moment. Now, under the Limitation Acts in the UK, I think it's usually 3 years from the date that you realise that your injury has sustained. And that sometimes can be a lot longer than actually the, than the 3 years. 3 years from knowing when the injury is sustained, which is why we tend to say 6 years from where there's been a claim or an incident involved, holding on to those records.
Thanks very much, Amanda. And the next question, according to the list that I can see, is from Peter Hart. You have a comment.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you everybody else for attending. Really, it's just a point what we're going to do actually with these questions. At the moment, we've got a frequently asked questions section on the website with 25 questions. I think as a result of this seminar, it might increase by a couple or a few more. So our intention is to log some of these and the pertinent ones actually add to that section. The other one, really go back to Ben's comment about, I call it street orienteering, sorry, because I find urban a bit of a weird, what is urban? With street orienteering, near misses, I would say we're seeing athletes running into things more frequently. And we are going to be working with Howdens to introduce an app for clubs to look at to register near misses and also to help them with dynamic risk assessments as well. At the moment, unlike Scottish Orienteering Association, with the work with Tim's done up there, we don't have a method of recording those. But I agree with you, Ben, that we do need to look at that a bit more closely. It's still quite new in this sport, and recognise the potential for risk in street orienteering.
I would always welcome that, Peter. Thank you.
There
was another question. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Suzanne was the next on the list. Over to you, Suzanne.
Definitely. Yeah, I was just want to clarify, does the employer's liability actually cover the a planner or an organizer at an event if they injure themselves in the course of their organising and planning duties? Right.
Irrespective of who they are, the employer's liability is there to protect the club. So if someone is deemed to be a volunteer or deemed to be an employee at the club's session, then that's where we would direct it. So it's there. So we may not necessarily know at the date that an injury is sustained whether they are going to be classed as an employee, a volunteer, an individual member. It will very much depend on the circumstances. But the reason we have the employer's liability is because if a clever solicitor wants to go under employment law rather than just public liability, duty of care law, then there will be a stricter liability sometimes attaching to that, and they sometimes can be more successful. So which is why we want to protect the club. So it's the club that we're protecting irrespective of how that claim may present itself, really. I hope that helps.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that if I am out planning an event and I fall down something and break my leg, then I would sue the club.
Potentially, but you'd have to obviously prove that the club were at fault.
Well, yes, the club were at fault. Yes, okay.
Yeah.
So it is a question of someone being at fault rather than just an accident. So there's no accident insurance.
It's not a personal accident policy.
Right.
It is still a liability policy.
Yeah,
so somebody has to prove there was negligence attaching to the injury, whether that's on employer's liability, or it's just that sometimes on certain approaches on employer's liability, it's a stricter liability than under a general liability policy.
That's great. Thank you, Amanda. That makes sense now.
No problem. There was a question that I saw come in about volunteers as well. I think it's gone through now. A volunteer organiser who isn't on a committee, it doesn't matter. Volunteers, as long as they are registered or recorded and known volunteer within the club, they are dependent, and they're not acting beyond their role in that volunteer environment. And that's the key thing really here. You'll have committee members who have a specific role, and you'll have people helpers. You'll have helpers in a club. It's inevitable. Every club. I mean, I work with netball. I've got kids in football clubs. I've got athletics club. You know, we see helpers come and go all the time. The key thing is ensuring that that helper knows the remit of their role and what's expected of them, really. And they would be protected like any other volunteer within the insurance programme.
Thanks, Amanda. And the next question is from Richard, president of SOA.
Yeah, hi, Amanda. I mean, it feels really comfortable, all the protection that you've described here. And sorry, my camera's not working, so you can't see my face. But the when does it break down with the insurers? So, for example, if somebody doesn't put the right risks on a risk form, and then an incident happens that hasn't been identified on the risk form, do you still cover us?
Yeah. The aim is that we are there to defend you for mistakes that may have been made, which has resulted in negligence. That's what a liability policy is there to try and support you with. Now, if it's knowingly and deliberately ignoring rules and ignoring process, then the insurers would probably be well within their right to say this was a deliberate act which directly resulted in the injury, and they might walk away. But where it's an innocent omission, we're touching on the error and omission, for example, in the professional indemnity. If it's an innocent omission and you've done what you consider, and you know you can prove that you've acted reasonably to your level of knowledge and ability, then the insurer, that's what the insurance is there to support you, because you potentially, I mean, there's no black and white on a claim, unfortunately, in liability. I wish there was. It would make life a lot easier for everybody, but on a liability claim, there is no black and white. But the aim of a liability policy is to defend you where you have accidentally made a mistake which has resulted in a negligence occurring.
Okay, that's really helpful. So basically, willful negligence, we'd be in trouble, but otherwise we're quite well protected. Good, thank you.
And that comes back also to that health and safety statement about don't overcomplicate it. You know, you're often doing a lot of these things automatically anyway. You know, and there's a certain expectation. And I would love to say that in this court many years ago, they would have looked at voluntary organisations slightly differently to corporate entities. I'm not sure that that's the same anymore with the awareness of the ability to make claims. There is a high expectation on your duty of care, really. I hope that's helped.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amanda. And the next question is from Gordon.
Hi. British Orienteering Club. A few members are only members of our club, but not members of British Orienteering. Are they covered with the insurance?
Peter? Peter Hart, sorry. Can I just ask you to dip in there, because my understanding is that they should become members of British Orienteering.
Yeah, I think my first question back is ask Gordon the question: are they insured for what? What are you looking for them to be insured for?
Okay, if they're competing in a registered event, then my understanding from what I've heard tonight is that even if they were non-members, they would be covered anyway. Is that correct?
For a registered competition, they would be insured, yes.
Okay, so irrespective of whether they're just club members and not British Orienteering members, that doesn't, as long as the event is registered, it has no impact whatsoever.
It has an impact on if you do club activities. If they've done more than 3 club activities, they would not be insured for club activities. Now, just to, some of you might be thinking this is nuts. Just to give you some background of this. The 3 activities rules been in for way before I came on board with British Orienteering, and I think it was around last century actually. And we also had you had to be a member to be sorry, if you did more than 3 competitions, you had to be a member. Now we recognise that clubs could not manage that. You had no idea if somebody's flip-flopping from one club to another doing competitions. You could not manage that. So the board in the renewal process in 2019, I think it was, agreed to cover all non-members for competitions, just to give a bit of safety for the organisers. But when it comes to activities, the clubs should know, they should be taking register of attendees. They should know if people have done at least three activities. So that's why it seems a bit perverse, but that's why it's in place. Otherwise, as Amanda said in introduction, why bother having a membership scheme at all? We just don't need any members. Just let people crack on and orienteer, and just insure them somehow. I don't know quite how we pay for that, but that's in effect the other option we have here.
And in this, sorry to interrupt, in this context, an activity is a non-registered event, not registered with British Orienteering, correct?
The activity would be registered as an activity.
Or registered as an activity, but
Correct.
a non-competitive.
But it's not a competition. Yep.
Right. Okay.
But it's just the club meets the like-mindedness of the members being together, training and preparing for club activity.
And I have one additional question regarding excesses on the policy.
Yes.
And I noticed in the documentation £250 public liability, 2,500 for corporate liability.
That's the corporate legal liability. So if you are if there's an allegation for mismanagement against the corporate legal entity, this is not against individual directors and officers. That's completely separate. It only applies if it's against the corporate legal entity. Then the defence has a 2,500 excess applying to it. That's not uncommon in that particular extension. And then on the property damage, it is property damage only on the public liability. And that is third-party property damage. If you've injured somebody's premises at a club event, for example, or fences or gates, etc., and you are negligent, then for property damage only, there will be a £250 excess.
And the corporate legal entity in this case is the club?
It would be if the club is a limited company. If you are unincorporated, so you are just a committee with a constitution, it will not apply because there isn't a legal entity to go against. But if you are a limited company, or if you are a registered charity, and you are recorded as a registered legal entity, then and the claim came against them under mismanagement side. So we're not talking about personal injury, we're talking about like an injury. If it was a mismanagement of the club, then that's where it'd be directed. Now, very often that corporate legal liability is more to do with shareholder organisations and various things, but we've always added it in just in case there's a couple of legal entities out there and the claims cross between a director officer and an entity.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amanda. And next on the list is Tim.
Right. I've probably got lots of questions, but I'll try to keep it to one or two. I'll make a statement first. I like your don't overcomplicate. But could I ask that the British Orienteering review their keywords, because it starts to overcomplicate things in a risk assessment if you've got to address uneven ground, because if you're in a forest, the ground is uneven and you also have prickly bushes, right? So inclusion of basic things like that, just tend to complicate the risk assessment. People expect to encounter those things. They know about them before they come.
Tim, could
Well,
I
let me-
just
let me
interject
come on-
there? Sorry. Can I just interject there? Because I touched on it in the claims notification element. If you don't have it listed in that risk assessment, if it's not written down, it didn't exist. And it therefore means that you haven't evidenced that you've thought about it. And it's evidencing that you've thought about it. Now, it may be it's a standard statement in all your risk assessments because it's uneven ground, but it must be recorded that you've thought about it, because we wouldn't be defensible in a court if we haven't got that risk assessment proving that you've thought about the uneven ground. It sounds silly, I know, but if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. And I've been on 3 legal training sessions in the last 6 months alone, and that has been the opening line with every one of them on a claims handling.
So the real statement is, don't overcomplicate it beyond what the legal side has already complicated it by. Right?
It's just evidencing. All we're asking you to do is evidence.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
If it's a statement, if the obvious has to be stated, then I personally regard that as complicating it, because you're distracting people from key things like having people running at 15 miles an hour through a crowd of people in an urban event, right? Which I'm glad to say here you said that hadn't led to more claims, but in a forest you don't have the crowd of people. In a town you do. You're bound to be a higher risk, right? Okay. Anyway, my question is roughly how many incidents are notified to you each year from British Orienteering?
I don't have that information with me, I'm afraid, and I couldn't necessarily share it specifically, but we do share it with orienteering, so we can get that to you separately. We can just do I'll do a general paper on claims separately for you, but I haven't got that information to share tonight.
Peter?
Sorry about that, Tim. I can look and see what we report to Amanda, but that wouldn't be the whole list, because some people can go.
You.
Sorry.
How many are reported to British Orienteering?
If you just bear with us, that's what I was trying to say. I have got a list. I haven't got it in front of me how many it is, and we as part of the annual review, we say how many claims are outstanding as well. But I can come back to that. I can come back. We do have a list. People do report. I had one over the weekend, for instance, where, funny enough, urban orienteer ran into a lamppost, which is not an uncommon thing for them to do, to run street furniture. That happens, and that notification came to us, which we will inform Howdens. But the likelihood of that coming to a claim is very low indeed. But we do have a list of people that submit incidents to us. And that ranges this year or last year from deaths to very, very minor injuries.
Okay. Right, thank you.
Thanks very much for that. And next on my list is Jane again. Jane, over to you.
Sorry, if I'm allowed to ask 2 questions. Back to these taster sessions, which I've never heard that term before, and I've been orienteering for 40 years, so I'm not sure where that term came from. So we've got a non-member who comes to ladies running on a Monday, club training on a Wednesday, and goes to the pub with us on a Thursday. So that's it. They're no longer allowed to come to any event, any activities. Is that correct?
So, sorry, Jane, I don't think that's what was said. I think what was said was they're no longer covered for, with the insurance. So it's not a case
So
they
we're
can't.
allowed to say to them, you can come to another event, but you're not covered by insurance, and that's a good thing, is it? Is that a?
Well, no, I don't think it's a good thing at all. And I think this is where it's very important for clubs to be open and honest to these people at the start, and also give them a good experience, so they want to be part of the family. But
I think.
Yeah, sorry,
Peter,
Amanda.
can I just interject there? I think one of the most important things from our perspective that the insurers will often look at is if you've got events or regular activity open to non-members, you've still got a duty of care to your members, and that's safeguarding. You've got no, if they're not meeting your constitution rules because they're not a member, you've got no controls, and you can't challenge them. You can't, you've got disciplinary matters that you can't deal with a non-member. All these things that you're protecting your own members from, but a non-member is bringing in. You don't know. They're not part of the same rules and constitution and process. And it does bring additional exposure on you and your club in that perspective, really. And as Peter said, and I think I touched on earlier, it's a membership organisation. The whole point is let's build income into the sport to keep it going, and that brings in members and develop. That's what the aim of a lot of membership organisations are. The clubs. I mean, I touched on earlier. I'm involved with a football club, a athletics club, a netball club. I'm a member of all of those. I'm a helper of all of those, and we encourage all of the people that come and have a go to join, to contribute, because money's tight at the moment. To keep those clubs going, we need those membership contributions. And we can, once they're in the family, you can help manage them. You can manage your safeguarding. You've got a duty of care as the committee to keep those people safe, your members safe. And if you have got lots of non-members regularly coming to just general activity with access to children, etc., what controls have you got to manage them? And that's looking at the one extreme to the other effectively.
Thanks very much, Amanda. And I believe there's just one more question now from Richard from SOA.
Yep, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Well, I guess I get a couple of things. I mean, one is I'm just going to make an observation, and we're going to have to deal with it outside of this session, that in Scotland we do have the added complication that we have Scottish Orienteering Association only members who are not members of British Orienteering. So that means we have to cover those members in a different way because they're not covered by British Orienteering's insurance, as described tonight, if I've understood this all correctly. And that was always my understanding. So that's one thing. So we'll deal with that separately, Jane. I'm sure you'll have some questions about that.
Yeah, I can only talk about British Orienteering
Yeah, I
Insurance
appreciate
Programme.
that, Amanda.
Yeah.
I'm just very conscious we've got quite a significant number of people who are members of clubs who are not members of British Orienteering. And therefore, all of we've discussed here, we've just got an added layer of complication to deal with. I did have a question, and I apologise, you may have answered it, or I may have just not been listening clearly, or somebody else answered.
That's normal in insurance.
This is about volunteers who are not members of British Orienteering. So are they, just to be clear, are they covered by the insurance as de facto employees, if you like, even if they're not members of British Orienteering?
I'm glad to see Peter's nodding as well. Within the world of voluntary organisations, we accept that there is always going to be somebody that just comes and helps. We encourage them to become a member in some form. And a lot of organisations and a lot of clubs will have a volunteer membership, which might be at a lower cost, but you've still got elements I touched on earlier about elements of control and knowing that you can do the checks on them that you need to do, DBS, if they're in a regulatory role and those types of things. But we do recognise that people will just come and help every now and again or need support, and within that own club. And so, yeah, well, in that volunteer heading, that's where they would sit from our perspective.
But you would expect at an event, a competition, we'll use a competition, that the organizer, the main event officials, which we'll say will be organizer, planner, controller, would have to be members of British Orienteering. I think that's in the guidelines. That's
historically been my understanding. Am I correct? Yeah, if it's a registered event of that kind, that competition, then everybody that is in there holds the right role and qualification to volunteer at that event.
Yeah. I just raise it because we've got a lot of people who are not members of British Orienteering who volunteer and do a lot of roles in at events and competitions. Okay.
There's been a couple of questions about whether the slides will be available after. Yes, I believe we are sharing it. It's going to be available in the members area of your website and will be shared.
Yeah, and what I'll do is I'll share the slides directly with you, with all the people that have attended tonight, so you've got a copy. We've recorded this this session tonight. That will go onto the webinar section of the website, and if we're lucky, we'll also get it onto the YouTube channel that we've got as well. So it will be recorded, so you can look back at it and find out information again. According to my list, there are no other questions that I can see that have popped through. If there aren't any more, I'd just like to finish up by saying, first of all, thank you to Peter Hart, who's just put his hand up. Now he's taken it down.
Sorry, Howard, I had one question, and it's not for me, actually. It may be for some of the clubs here. In fact, I think DVO are looking into this. In some clubs are looking at contracting development officers, so not employing, but in effect subcontracting development officers. Would any of our insurance cover them for their activities? I don't know.
I was going to say, directed at me, it will depend on their contract, obviously, if it's a contract for services, but it also depends on how regularly they're being used. So if they're a subcontractor, if they're a member in that role with yourself and they don't pay would they fall into that £10,000 turnover category? Then we would be insuring them as a subcontractor under that heading, as long as they're registered as a member. As regards to the club and the potential employer's liability, it will depend on the regularity and the equipment that they give them as to whether they may be considered, even on contract for services, an employee. So they'd need to be careful how their contract is worded and how they operate with them. Okay.
Thanks very much, Amanda, and thanks very much, Peter. So yeah, what I was going to say was thanks very much for everyone for giving up your time and for also spending your time before the webinar to form the questions. My inbox was getting pretty busy with questions, and thanks very much for that. And Peter and I and Amanda have agreed that we will refresh the frequently asked questions that are on the website to take into account what we've discussed tonight and formally the questions that came in. And hopefully you feel better informed about the insurance policy that we have in place. And you've all got my email address, and if there are other questions that come through, we'll do our very best to answer them. And again, just thanks so much for your time this evening. If I can just put a quick shout out to the next webinar, which interestingly is around safeguarding. That will be on the 27th of February, led by Peter Brook, who was with us, but then his computer crashed, so he left, but hopefully he'll get it fixed by the 27th. That information will be going out in the newsletter. Oh, it's back. That information will be going out in the newsletter, which I believe will be going out in the next couple of days, the members newsletter, and you'll be able to book on it that way. So thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it, and I hope you found it worthwhile. Thank you very much.